Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive. You know we love getting into the nitty-gritty here. And today we're going to be talking about something that I think is really fascinating.
Yeah.
We're looking at these reports about American M1A1 Abrams tanks, you know, the ones that Russia says it's captured in Ukraine.
Right.
Now, I know what you might be thinking, tanks. Isn't that like old school warfare?
Yeah.
But I think this story's got some serious implications, not just for the conflict in Ukraine, but for like the whole future of armored warfare.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think when you have something like an intact Abrams, especially the M1A1, falling into enemy hands, well, that's a pretty big deal. This isn't just some propaganda victory for Russia. I mean, think about it.
Yeah.
Their engineers, you know, over at the Uralvagonzavod tank factory, they're going to have a field day with this. They can tear it apart, analyze every nut and bolt, really get a sense of how it works. I mean, we're talking reverse engineering,
Right.
Figuring out the armor composition, the fire control systems, the whole shebang.
This is like, what? They got the cheat codes for a video game or something?
Yeah, kind of, but with much, much higher stakes, obviously. Russia's going to be looking for any weakness, any vulnerability they can exploit, not just to use against Abrams in Ukraine, but potentially against any country that uses them. Right.
Right. So that's why everyone's making such a fuss about these captured tanks. But okay, let's talk about the tanks themselves. Some of the reports coming out of Ukraine, they're saying the Abrams isn't exactly living up to the hype. Like, we've got stories about armor problems. One source even used the term melting armor. I mean, that's got to be a bit of an exaggeration, right?
Well, they're probably talking about depleted uranium armor, which is a feature in the more recent U.S. Abrams models. It's really dense, really effective, but if it gets hit just right, it can fragment and, you know, superheat. Creates this kind of molten metal effect. But, you know, it's important to remember battlefield reports, you know, they're often chaotic. They don't always give us the full picture.
Yeah, that's true. But even if we take those reports with a grain of salt, there's still this thing about Ukrainian tankers actually preferring their old Soviet-era T-72s in certain situations.
Yeah.
I mean, why would they choose to go with a tank that's like decades older?
I know. It seems kind of counterintuitive, right?
Yeah.
But there are some tactical reasons that actually make sense. So the T-72, even though it's less advanced, it's also simpler. Ukrainian crews have been working with them for ages. They know them inside and out. Mastering the Abrams, that's a whole different story. Even for experienced tankers, it takes some serious training. And plus, the T-72s are lighter, more nimble, and that matters a lot when you're dealing with the muddy terrain you find in parts of Ukraine.
Ah, okay. So we're starting to see how the actual battlefield conditions, you know, the reality on the ground, can really impact how effective even the most high-tech weapon is, huh?
Exactly. Plus, I think it's important to remember that the Abrams was designed for a very specific type of warfare. Think large-scale battles, lots of maneuvering, open terrain, kind of like what we saw in the Gulf Wars. The fighting in Ukraine, well, it's way more fluid, you know. Lots of urban combat, close quarters engagements, and a ton of mines and ambushes.
So are we saying the Abrams is like the wrong tool for the job in Ukraine?
Not necessarily. I mean, it's still a powerful tank, and it can be effective if it's used strategically. But it's true. You know, its strengths might not be fully utilized in this particular conflict.
Okay. So it's not just about the tank, it's how it's used and the battlefield itself. But hey, what about those reports that the export model of the Abrams, the one sent to Ukraine, don't have all the bells and whistles of the U.S. versions? Is there any truth to that?
Well, there is some truth to that. I mean, the U.S., for national security reasons, pretty much always provides export versions of its most advanced weapons. And those versions, they often lack certain technologies, you know, things related to electronic warfare, countermeasures, that kind of stuff.
So the Abrams in Ukraine might be tough, but they might not represent the full, like the peak of what American tanks can do. Why would the U.S. hold back on giving Ukraine the very best?
Well, you know, it's a balancing act. On one hand, the U.S. wants to help Ukraine defend itself. But there's always that worry about super sensitive technology ending up in the wrong hands, which, well, looks like that's what's happened here. It's a tricky situation for sure.
Yeah, that's for sure. It's a lot to consider. I mean, we've got like this whole web of factors at play. But before we get too deep into that, I think it's worth thinking about what this all means for other countries that use the Abrams, right? Places like Poland, Australia, Taiwan, they must be watching all of this really, really closely.
Oh, yeah. They definitely are. I mean, this whole situation's got to be a wake-up call, not just for countries with Abrams, but, you know, anyone using advanced weapons systems. It really shows you, you know, having the best tech on paper doesn't mean you automatically win on the battlefield.
Right. Right. You mentioned that before, but let's dig into that a little more. Like, what specific challenges has the Abrams run into in Ukraine? We talked about the terrain, the training differences, the whole export model thing.
Yeah.
But what about Russian tactics? Are they doing anything like specifically targeting the Abrams' weaknesses?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the Russians, they've obviously been studying the Abrams, figuring out how to take it down. One of their big things is using drones.
Yeah.
And not just for scouting, but to guide artillery fire and even launch attacks themselves.
So it's not just about having a strong tank. It's about fighting an enemy who's figured out how to beat it.
Exactly. And remember those tandem warhead missiles we talked about?
Yeah.
Those have been a real game changer for the Russians. I mean, think about it. The first charge takes out the reactive armor on the Abrams, and then bam, the second one goes straight through the main armor. It's like a 1-2 punch, really tough to defend against.
So even with all that fancy armor, the Abrams isn't invincible. Nope. No tank is. And it's worth noting, those tandem warhead missiles, they come in all sorts of flavors. Some are guided, some attack from the top where the armor's weakest. Russia's been using a whole mix of them, which makes things even tougher for the Abrams crews.
Man, sounds like a total nightmare being in one of those tanks facing an enemy that's like custom built to take you out.
Yeah, it's definitely intense. It really shows you how important training is, for the crews. And tactical awareness. You can give someone a super advanced tank, but if they don't know how to use it, how to think ahead, how to use the terrain, well, they're in trouble.
Totally. Okay, but let's zoom out a bit. Big picture time. If even the Abrams, the big dog, can be taken down, what does that say about tanks in general? Are we seeing the end of the line for tanks? Is that what we're getting at here?
That's the million-dollar question, right? It's been a big debate in military circles for years, and what's happening in Ukraine, well, it's definitely adding fuel to the fire. Some people are saying, look, with these precision weapons, drones, all these anti-tank systems, tanks are just obsolete. They're dinosaurs.
Yeah, I can see why people would say that. But is it really that simple, though?
Warfare. Simple. Come on. Look, tanks are facing new challenges, for sure. But let's not forget, they've been declared obsolete before plenty of times.
Right.
And yet they always seem to adapt, prove their worth.
So it's more like an evolution, not extinction.
Exactly. Think about any new weapon, any new tactic. There's always a period of adjustment. Back when machine guns came along, chaos. They tore apart traditional infantry. But armies adapted, figured out new tactics, new defenses.
So it's all about adapting, both with the tech and how you use it.
Bingo. And when it comes to tanks, we're already seeing lots of investment in tech that's designed to make them tougher, more effective.
Like what? What kind of stuff are we talking about?
Well, one of the really promising areas is active protection systems, APS for short. It's kind of like a high-tech shield, uses sensors to detect incoming threats, missiles, and rockets, then uses countermeasures to neutralize them before they hit.
Whoa, okay, now that sounds straight out of sci-fi. Is this like actually in use?
It is. Several countries are using it. Israel, Russia, even the US has tanks with APS now. And the technology keeps getting better.
So the tank's not going down without a fight, it's changing with the times. But is fancy tech enough, or do we need to rethink how tanks are actually used on the battlefield?
I think both are essential, to be honest. On the tactical side, we're seeing a shift. It's less about tanks being the main attack force, more about combining them with other units.
You're talking like integrating them with infantry, artillery, air support, like a team effort, not just sending tanks in to do everything.
Right, exactly. You get the strengths of each unit while minimizing the weaknesses. Tanks can blast through defenses, infantry secures the ground, air support provides cover. It's all about synergy.
Way more sophisticated than just tanks, charge.
Yeah, definitely. And that's where things are headed, this integrated multi-domain approach, not just for tanks, but all parts of the military.
So, bottom line, are tanks still relevant in this day and age?
Like I said, warfare is never simple. It's all about the specifics. Tanks probably aren't going away, but their role is definitely changing. They're not the undisputed champs anymore, more like specialized tools that need skilled operators, smart tactics, and got to work alongside other forces to be truly effective.
So the future of the tank depends on what? Adaptation, innovation, not just with tech, but how we think about using them.
Exactly. And that's why this whole discussion matters, not just for the military folks, but for anyone who wants to understand how modern war really works.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about, but before we wrap up, I'm curious about something. We focused on the Abrams struggles in Ukraine, but haven't there been times when it's actually done really well? What can we learn from those successes?
That's a great point, and one we'll dig into more when we come back.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the Abrams challenges over in Ukraine, but I think it's important to remember it's not all doom and gloom. There have been some, successes too, right? What can we learn from those?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's easy to focus on the negative, but the Abrams has had some wins for sure. There have been moments where it's, really outperformed the Russian tanks, shown what it can do. It's all about using the right tool for the right job, right?
Right. So, can you give us an example? I remember you mentioned the Abrams is best suited for open terrain, right? Has it lived up to that?
Oh, yeah. There have been reports of Abrams engaging Russian tanks at long range and, really hitting them hard. They've got those superior optics and fire control systems that really makes a difference in those situations.
So it's not just about having a powerful tank, it's about using it smart, playing to its strengths. Makes sense. Any other takeaways from how the Abrams has performed in Ukraine?
I think one of the biggest lessons is, how important training and experience are for the crews. The Ukrainians who've had a chance to really train on the Abrams have been much more effective at using it. It just goes to show, even the most advanced tech, you need skilled people to run it.
Yeah, I mean, you can give someone the best tools, but without the know-how, they're not going to get the most out of it.
Yeah.
That's a good reminder, I guess. So bigger picture, I mean, this applies beyond just tanks, right?
Absolutely. Any complex system weapons, industrial equipment, even software, investing in training in people is super important, just as important, if not more so than the tech itself.
It's like the human element, the skills, that's what makes it all work.
Yeah.
So bringing this back to our listeners, what's the key takeaway from all this, this whole deep dive into tanks under fire?
Well, I think the main takeaway is that warfare, it's complicated, right? It's never black and white. It's all about context, different factors all coming together. And the Abrams in Ukraine, it's a perfect example of that. It's not about one tank being better than another. It's about understanding the strengths and weaknesses, the strategy, the training, the adaptation, and always being open to learning.
It's easy to get caught up in the hype, but the reality is always more complicated. And like you said, there's always something new to learn. This conflict, it's still going on. So there's going to be more to learn as it develops.
So as we wrap things up here, what's the one thing you'd like listeners to think about as they follow this story?
I'd say think critically, question everything, look for different perspectives. The world of military tech, it changes fast. Warfare changes fast. But if we stay informed, stay curious, then we can all understand these complex issues better.
And on that note, folks, that's our deep dive for today. Whether you're into military stuff, history, or just trying to make sense of what's going on in the world, this interplay of tech, strategy, and the human element, it's crucial. So keep exploring, keep learning, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.